Thing I want to do is to point out something. We're looking at a part of the Old Testament now that has many very familiar stories. And a lot of the material that I'll be looking at very briefly today is material that we have covered here in this class very thoroughly at one time. And I'll just sort of brush over it because there are actually just 2 points that I want to make. And at the end of the session, I'm going to find out whether I'd made those 2 points. And I'll tell you what those 2 points are when we get to it, what I was looking for. Going back to Samuel, the first book of Samuel, we find out that we start looking at the history of the Israelites, starting with their being in Shiloh, a town in Ephraim, where they had set up the ark and the tabernacle, and they had the Shiloh priests. The chief priest at that time was a man named Eli, and he had two worthless sons. And the people in Shiloh and in Ephraim got themselves involved in a war with the Philistines. And what had happened is that these 2 sons had managed to take the Ark of the Covenant into a battle. And not only were they killed, but the Ark was also taken over by the Philistines. And the Philistines came in and they devastated Shiloh. Now it doesn't say that in Samuel, but we have to infer that from other parts of the Bible that Shiloh was completely devastated. That meant that a lot of the people that were in Shiloh had to get out. Among those people getting out were the Shiloh priests, the people that were associated with the tabernacle at that time. And they all fled to a little city not far from Jerusalem, a little city called Nod. And while they were in Nod, apparently David's family became acquainted with them, probably through Samuel, who was also in that region. And when David got into some real trouble with Saul, and when Saul was trying to kill him, David fled to those priests in Nod. They helped David out. They gave David a sword. And it turned out that there was one of Saul's spies was hanging around that the place where those priests were. And they saw those priests helping David. And later we find out that Saul became very disturbed that nobody seemed to be able to tell him where David was. And this man that was spying there, the guy by the name of Doeg told Saul that he had seen these priests at Nod helping David. So Saul went to those priests at Nod and tried to get from them information where David might have been, and also get them to admit that they had helped David. And when Saul was convinced that they were guilty in helping David, he ordered his men to kill those priests. Those Shiloh priests, and nobody wanted to do it except that man Doeg, that servant of Saul's. And according to the story, he then killed 85 of the priests at that time, but one got away. That was the son of Ahimelech, who was the chief priest at that time. That son's name was Abiathar. And Abiathar took it upon himself to go to the only place that he felt safe. Anything that had to deal with Saul would not be a good idea. So what he did is he fled to David. David at that time was an outlaw living at a cave called Adullam, where a lot of other people that were, since outlaws, were living as well. And Abiathar joined up with David. And for the next few years, Abiathar is constantly at David's side, while David is an outlaw trying to get away from Saul. How close that relationship really became, we don't really know. Except if we try to figure it out, we find out that both of them were in their early 30s. They were still quite young men. But Abiathar was then with David during those outlaw years. The time came when David decided living this way is not a good idea, and he decided to go to the only place that he felt he might have some safety from Saul, and that would go back to the Philistines. Now, he had tried to flee to the Philistines once before, but they remembered that David had been designated as a very important man in Saul's court. He was the one that where the women sang about Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And the Philistines were very suspicious of David, and David realized that he was in trouble in that situation. So he feigned madness, and Achish, who was the king at that time, said he had enough madmen and enough insane people around him already, didn't need David, and David had to leave. Then near the end of these outlaw years, David decided to go back to Achish, but this time he came with a troop of his own soldiers, some of his followers, and he and Achish immediately hit it off. And Achish recognized, all right, David's probably all right, and he assigned a city to David where David could live with his entourage, a city called Ziklag. Now, it happened that about that time there was an impending battle between the Philistines and Saul. And this battle is going to take place up north, a little bit south of the Sea of Galilee. And the Philistines started to move their troops up north to meet Saul's troops. They got as far as Megiddo, maybe a little bit past that. They got to Aphek, I think it was, when they had a parade of all the different armies that were going to go up to the Philistine armies. And some of these other Philistine generals saw David's army go through it. He said, just a second, we don't want that guy around here. Isn't he Saul's son-in-law? How do we know he's not going to turn on us? And so they convinced Achish to get rid of David, send David back down south to the place he came from. Well, while that army was moving up north like that, all the Philistine soldiers were moving north. The Amalekites came into that territory of the Philistine territory and raided many of the cities and looted the cities, including Ziklag, the place where David was living. And they took not only the women and children, but also any of the gold and silver they could find, and also a lot of the flocks, the sheep and the herds. When David got back to the Philistine territory and went back to Ziklag, he had found out what had happened, and he was very disturbed. And this is one of the first times that we get some indication, I hope, on this next slide. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him because of all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord God. And David said to Abiathar, that's that man that I told you that escaped from Nod, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. What was the ephod? That was going to give Abiathar the ability to talk with God. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? And he answered, pursue, for you shall surely overtake, and you shall surely rescue. So David set out, and there was 600 men, and they were with him, and they went and they came. This is where they came, where they stayed. And David went on in pursuit. He and 400 men, 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the river. What we find is that David caught up with these Amalekites, and David smote them from twilight till the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. And David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, either whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil, anything that had been taken. David brought it all back. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and people drove those cattle before him and said, this is David's spoil. In other words, David had a tremendous amount of success in getting at those Amalekites. The Amalekites had a lot of success in raiding all those Philistine cities while those Philistine armies were moving up north. This is the only picture I could find of the battle. The next slide is a very important one. When David came back from Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, "Here is a present for you from the spoil of the enemies of the Lord." It was for those being Bethel, and here's the names of the cities. It's the only one important here. And they sent it to Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. So when he was an outlaw, David became well acquainted with a lot of the people that were in Judah. And now that he had all this spoil, he did not want to take it for himself. He could have made himself a rich man. He gave it to all these people, particularly mentioned here Hebron. The important thing I want to point out here is that who did David know that he should, how did David find out that this was the right thing to do? Well, he had inquired of the Lord through Abiathar. Abiathar was acting as a spokesman, as the priest. After this, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up into any of the places in Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." And David said, "To which shall I go up?" And the Lord said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel, Abigail the widow of Nabal. And David brought up his men who were with him, everyone in his household, and they dwelt in the town of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Now this is significant. David had Judah, we talked about this a little bit before that. Judah sort of stands off from the rest of the 10 tribes, the 12 tribes. And what we find is David actually is being anointed the king of Judah. And he does actually serve as a king of Judah for 7 years. In the meantime, what happened to Saul's army? Saul's army was defeated by the Philistines, and they fled over across the Jordan River. And one of the generals, a guy by the name of Abner, tried to set up the kingdom again, and he took one of Saul's sons, a guy by the name of Ishbosheth, and made him the new king. That was Saul's son. So Ishbosheth became a king of the 10 tribes to the north, and with Abner as the general or the head of the army. Now, I think I said after, or I think I've got a slide here that actually says David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. You want to keep those dates in mind. He's 30 years old, and he reigned for 40 years. He reigned over Judah. Actually, I think I had a slide, I can't find it right now. What had happened is that the people to the north, and those 10 tribes, and Judah, sort of got themselves involved in a civil war. And they had been united under Saul, but now they were fighting each other. And there were some battles that were rather reasonable to say, in terms of being fierce battles. And Abner was the strong man of the northern tribes. I'll abbreviate this just a little bit now. As would happen, there are other events that played a role here. There was a woman in among Saul's concubines by the name of Rizpah, and Abner took a liking to Rizpah, and Rizpah and Abner became a thing, you might say. Ishbosheth got upset about this. As the new king, Ishbosheth was supposed to have inherited all the concubines, but now all of a sudden Abner is sticking his nose into it. And what happened is that Ishbosheth reprimanded Abner and criticized him. Abner got very upset. He'd done everything to put that man up as the kingship. Now all of a sudden he's being criticized by him. And what Abner does is he makes a move toward David, saying, look, there is a way that I probably could bring those 10 tribes under your control, under the kingship that you have here in Judah. And I think I have a slide to this effect. A strange request is made by David at that time. If you're going to do something like this, the first thing you got to do is bring back my wife, Michal. Remember, David was married to Michal, Saul's daughter, and she was the one that helped him escape. And he wanted Michal to come back. Now, we'll run into Michal a little bit later on for a different reason when she comes back. But let's take a look at what it says here. David was 30 years old when he began to reign. At Hebron, he reigned 7 years and 6 months. And the king, well, this slide is a little bit misplaced. Trying to keep track of the dates here is very difficult. Apparently what had happened is that after that rift between Abner and Ishbosheth, Abner got together with the rulers of the other 10 tribes and managed to convince them that it was to their advantage probably to side up with David. And so he goes and sides up with David. And I think what we find in another slide here, it wasn't too long, but then there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul became weaker. And sons were born to David at Hebron. Keep this in mind. His firstborn was Ammon. And then the next one is Absalom, and finally Adonijah. These 3 names show up as prominent names in the later parts of the history here. And says, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Abner became so strong that he was able to bring those tribes over in that fashion. When he brings them over, an interesting happens. David has a feast celebrating the fact that those rulers had come together under the direction of Abner. Joab, David's general at that time, took exception to that, and this is rather significant. Joab decided that was not a good idea and decided to get rid of Abner. Particularly, I think he saw Abner probably as being a threat to his own position, and we'll find Joab being involved in a murder of Abner. I'm bringing this up because this becomes important in next week's lesson. And he said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but one thing, you will bring Saul's daughter, and David send messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, and give me the wife of Michal, and I betrothed at the price of 200 foreskins. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, and we find that Michal now is all off with David down in Hebron. About this same time, they recognized that David now had control over the 10 tribes, and what position did Ishbosheth have? What we're told is that 2 of the soldiers that were in the army of Saul at that time decided that they would also try to get the favor of David, and what they did is they killed Ishbosheth and cut off his head and presented it to David. That's Ishbosheth's head. So what we find here now is that at the end of that civil war, David was successful largely because of the fact that Abner had helped him out in such a manner as to getting those tribes to come with them. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are as your bone and Saul. In the times past, Saul was our king over us, and it was you that had led us, that brought Israel and the Lord into you. And you shall be a shepherd to my people Israel, and you shall be the prince over all Israel. So the elders of the Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. At Hebron he reigned. These dates are kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting to put it together. What we have to conclude is that all of this was taking place when David was only about 30 years old. And 7 years later, we find there's a significant move. I think it's and the king well, let us look at this way. David now has control over the 12 tribes. He's living where? In Hebron. That's where his throne is. It's in Hebron. Living in Hebron, but most of the tribes are to the north. And he decides this is probably not a good idea to make that the throne. We've talked about this before. We ran into this situation here in the United States when the government was formed. There was a very strong faction in the north, like in Philadelphia and Boston, but also a very strong group in the south, like Richmond and places like that. And how did they handle that in the United States? Move the capital somewhere in between. They moved to Washington and made that the capital. David sees the same sort of thing. Now, Jerusalem was right between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. It was in the territory of Benjamin. And things get a little vague here as far as what the Bible tells us. But this tells us then the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. The people that were living in Jerusalem were people that had been there a long time. You could call them Canaanites because they were in Canaan, but they were Jebusites. That was the tribe that they came from. And the inhabitants of the land said to David, "You will not come here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off." In other words, a very well fortified city. Somehow or another, what we find out is that David, or probably it was Joab, that found a way of getting into the city. And David was able to get control of the city and was able then to move his throne from Hebron to Jerusalem. And most of what takes place now doesn't take place in Hebron, but takes place in Jerusalem. And it was told to King David, the Lord, all right, once he gets to Jerusalem, this section from Samuel 8, 2 Samuel 8, this whole chapter is a rather significant chapter. Once he gets there, David comes up with an interesting idea that was made known to him, and that is that the Ark of the Covenant, which the Philistines had taken and had gotten rid of, they sent that Ark back to Jerusalem. They sent that Ark back to Israel, but it never got all the way to Israel. It stopped at the home of, I think they mentioned the man's name here, and that man was very much blessed by having the Ark of the Covenant at his home. And David decides this might be the time to bring the Ark of the Covenant back. So they have a great to-do about bringing the Ark of the Covenant back, and this is one of the major things that David accomplished very early on in his reign in Jerusalem, is bringing the Ark of the Covenant back. And here is the rejoicing over the return of the Ark, and here's David. Up in this corner, this is Michal. His wife, that was brought back. She criticized him soundly for behaving the way he did, behaving like a kid. And actually, he was not fully clothed, I guess. And she said he was not, she realized he was an embarrassment to himself. And the only thing that it says concerning that is that Michal never had any children. Now, you could say it's because David was so upset with her over what she had said concerning his return of the ark. Or it could be something else, and that is that this was an indication there's no way that Saul's family is going to have any part of the royalty. If they could still say, okay, this is Saul's reign, not David's reign, because after all, his queen is the daughter of Saul. At any rate, keep that in mind, that one of the important things that David accomplished was getting the Ark of the Covenant back. And when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king, the Philistines went up in search of David, but David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. The stronghold means Jerusalem. And David inquired again of the Lord. This means he went to Abiathar. Shall I go up against the Philistines? Wilt thou give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, Go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. And David went in, and David defeated them there. And the Lord has broken through my enemies before like a bursting flood. Therefore the name of this place, the Philistines left their idols there, and David took them. In other words, David had a major victory here in defeating the Philistines. There also David dedicated to the Lord together with his gold and silver, and dedicated from the nations he subdued. I'll read this through rather carefully. And from Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and Hadadezer, and a little bit the Edomites, but look at this last one. And he put the garrisons of Edom throughout all Edom, from garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. Things couldn't be going better for David. He's in Jerusalem. He's in a stronghold, and he's brought the ark back, and he's also subduing most of his enemies. This might have been the time when David built up his reputation as being a very successful warrior, and David was living quite well at that particular time. This is also part of chapter 8 of 2 Samuel. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Hoda, was a recorder. But look at this. And Zadok, the son of and Ahimelech were the priests. Now this is taken straight from the Bible, and most of the commentaries mention that this was a mistake in transcription. Abiathar was the son of Ahimelech, not Ahimelech the son of Abiathar. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. All of a sudden, this man, Abiathar, who had been David's priest throughout all those years as an outlaw, and those years when he was with the Philistines, now all of a sudden, when David at his very pinnacle, we find that Abiathar is not the only priest, he's a co-priest. There are two priests. There's Zadok and there's Abiathar. That was one of the points I wanted to make. The other point is right this. Everything that has happened to David has been to his benefit. David was very much blessed. What's the other thing that was true about David? He had followed the Lord's commands. Everything that he had done was following the Lord's command. Here's the other point I was trying to make. It's about this time when the armies were out on the field, David was back in Jerusalem, because the armies at one time, the generals decided, hey, it's not a good idea that David go out on the field. He might get hurt, and we need him. They looked at him as a leader that they had to have. So he is home, and one afternoon when he's home, he's on his balcony, he looks down, he sees a pool, and he sees this woman. Anybody know her name? Bathsheba. And he became acquainted with Bathsheba. He became very well acquainted with Bathsheba, and it isn't long when she's pregnant. And now things start to happen. one way of trying to disguise the fact that there had been an affair between David and Bathsheba was to get Bathsheba's husband, whose name was Uriah, get him from the battlefield and bring him home and let him spend some time with Bathsheba, and this impending birth can be the result of a reunion between Uriah and Bathsheba. Uriah comes home, and David tells him, go spend some time with your wife, and Uriah doesn't do it. Rather than that, he goes to sleep at the king's door. The second night, David tried to get Uriah drunk to make him go spend time with Bathsheba. He still wouldn't do it. That led him to do the thing that we see in the next part. Here is a very telling picture. Here's David writing a letter to give to Uriah. And in this letter, it's a letter gives to Uriah. You give this to Joab. And what he says in that letter, when we get into battle, put Uriah in a position where he might have problems, where he could be killed. And as it turns out, in the morning he will set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fight and draw back from him that he may be struck down and die. So Joab was besieging the city. He assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab. Some of the servants of David among them fell, and Uriah was also killed. So now what do we have happening in a very short period of time? David gets involved in an adulterous affair with Bathsheba and gets himself implicated very directly with what? With the murder of Uriah. Is this following God's command? Now, according to the book of Deuteronomy, what Moses tells the people, he says, you're going to go into the promised land now. If you will follow God's command and our righteous people, everything will go well with you. Are things going well for David right now in terms of following God's command? No. It's a very curious thing. If you take a look at the rest of this chapter, the rest of this book of Samuel, this is book of 2 Samuel, nothing goes right for David. Everything goes wrong, and he's going to be punished. And the punishment comes in a very interesting fashion. He doesn't lose battles or anything. His whole family starts to fall apart. And what we find are some stories given in some great detail. By the way, I recommend very highly sitting down sometime for a couple of hours and read that whole 2 Samuel and look at the detail of how that is all recorded. Let's just jump on the point a little bit here. I want to go back here. What happens, the first thing that happens very shortly after the death of Uriah, when Uriah is dead, David and Bathsheba do get married, and they do have a son, but the son dies, and they are promised another son later on. Again, a very interesting story. I strongly urge using the Bible here. Don't rely on me. But what happens is that David is approached by Nathan the prophet. I bring Nathan's name in because he becomes important next week. Nathan the prophet condemns. Nathan the prophet comes up with an interesting story about a rich man taking advantage of a situation where a poor man is left holding the bag, you might say. And it really is the same sort of thing that David had experienced. He was a king, but he took Uriah's wife, and then he actually took Uriah's life. And now we're going to look at what happens to David after being reprimanded by Nathan in terms of his family. The first thing that is recorded is that, I did that one already. First thing that is recorded is something that it starts out with one of David's sons Ammon, he was the crown prince, takes a great liking to one of his half-sisters, a girl by the name of Tamar. Tamar was a full sister of Absalom. And there's a very interesting story. This is the seduction of Tamar by Ammon. You want to read this in the Bible yourself, how he manages to get to Tamar. Essentially, when he does get to Tamar, he rapes her and then finds out he doesn't like her that much and casts her out and makes her look as a disgrace. That's Absalom's sister. And what we're told is that Absalom did nothing about it, just let things go. Sometime later, Absalom decides to have a feast at the time of sheep herding or sheep shearing, a feast of all of his brothers. And all the brothers are gathered together under Absalom's care. And when Absalom gives the order, 2 of his servants kill Ammon. And the news gets back to David that all of his sons have been killed, and all he finds out is that Ammon has been killed. But David probably knew about this situation between Ammon and Tamar, and now he finds out that his crown prince, Ammon, has been killed by the next in line, namely Absalom. Absalom has to go into hiding. He does go into hiding, and what we find out is that David mourns the fact that Absalom is not there. Absalom must have been a very interesting individual, to say the very least, because Joab manages to find a way of getting Absalom back into Jerusalem. Absalom comes back, but he is told not to have any contact with David. David would rather not deal with him at all. And what we find is that Absalom then starts to get there. There's the killing of Ammon by David's servants. And what happens then is that when Absalom comes back, we get in the Bible we get a very good description of Absalom as being a man without blemish from his head to his toes, a very handsome man, a very charismatic person. And one of the first things that he does when he gets back, he buys himself a chariot and he goes riding through Jerusalem in that chariot, hailing the people, and also going to the city gate. And when people come into the city of Jerusalem, this is Absalom, see his long hair, this is Absalom, will approach these people and say, "Did you come here with a petition? It's too bad you're not going to get anybody to listen to you. You need somebody here to listen to you. Nobody's going to pay attention to you here." Trying to set himself up as being a potential leader. Absalom does get to the point where he is very, very popular among the people because of the things that he does. And is riding through town in a chariot and everything. Makes him look like a born leader. Then with the help of a little water. Help of a guy named Ahithophel. Absalom is given some advice. The advice is, why don't you take over the kingdom? And what happens is that Absalom puts out the proclamation that he wants to be king. He does this by taking Ahithophel's advice, taking part of David's harem and putting it on the roof of one of the buildings so that everybody can see that he is taking over the kingship by taking David's harem. And he also makes it known, when you hear the trumpet sound, then proclaim Absalom as king. And when that happens, David realizes that he has a rebellion on his hand. And David has to get out of town as fast as he can. Ahithophel tells Absalom, pursue David and kill him right now, and you'll come back as the king, no problem at all. And another advisor tells Absalom, don't do that, it's not a good idea. David has a large number of followers, and he probably has gone into hiding and the chances are that you'll just brand yourself as a traitor. So David manages to escape and gets across the river without being pursued by Absalom. And once across the river, Ahithophel realizes that his advice is not being taken, and that what's going to happen now is going to be disastrous as far as Absalom is concerned. And this is where we find the situation where one of the only 3 places or 4 places that I know of in the Bible where somebody commits suicide. It says that then Ahithophel went out and hanged himself. Please read this whole thing in the book. It's so much better in the book from what I'm saying right now. When David was fleeing across the river, another thing happened that was quite interesting. I'm bringing it. That's a little bit later. And that is all of a sudden Zadok and Abiathar, these 2 priests, they show up with the Ark of the Covenant to help David to have the help of the Lord with the Ark present as well. David tells them, no, go on back. I don't want to have defeat come with the Ark here, because people will see that the Lord is not that strong. But the point I'm making here is that Abiathar and Zadok work in unison. They both have the same thing in mind. They both are helping David. There is no instance anywhere in the whole situation that we have in the 2 Samuel that there's any animosity between Zadok and Abiathar, 2 co-priests. Next week we'll see that that's really quite different for another reason. There's the ark being taken back. What happens that then after David escapes, there does become a battle between Absalom's army and David's army, and Absalom is killed. And here again, I think is a very familiar picture. We're told that Absalom, when he was trying to escape, his hair, the beautiful hair, as a matter of fact, in the earlier part of talking about Absalom, they actually give you a measurement in pounds of how much his hair weighed every time they cut his hair. But it's the hair that got tangled in a branch, and Absalom was tangled hanging by his hair. And according to other parts of the story that evolved, Joab comes along and kills Absalom. So there's another murder of Joab. He kills Absalom. Absalom is dead. Now, who's going to tell David about this? David worked so hard to try to get Absalom back after Absalom had murdered Ammon. Now somebody has to tell David that Absalom has been killed. And Joab, well, I'll abbreviate a little bit here. Abiathar has a son by the name of Ahimaaz, and Zadok has a son named Ahimaaz, and Abiathar has a son named Jonathan. We find out those 2 boys were also very much involved in this rebellion, acting as spies, and we find that at one point they are almost discovered when they are hidden in a well by a woman, so that Absalom's men don't find them. Then it comes the time that Joab kills Absalom, and Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, says, "Let me go tell the fact that Absalom has been defeated, that David no longer has to worry about this rebellion." And Joab says, "No, you don't want to go and tell David something like that." And so Joab decides to send somebody else. He sends a runner by the name of, that are described only as a Cushite, for that runner to go and tell David. Ahimaaz takes it upon himself, no, I want him to tell David. And so he takes off on a different path and manages to get to David before the Cushite does. And then it's a Cushite that actually gives the bad news. But Ahimaaz manages to do this. Here are two instances where we have related to us in the book of Samuel certain things that only the person that was involved would have known about, the being hidden in the well and this running. And this is what led a lot of biblical scholars to believe that this court history probably was written by Ahimaaz, which makes pretty good sense. For one thing, being a priest's son, he would know how to write. And the other is that he was intimately involved with that family. He probably had the opportunity to write rather explicitly just what went on. After all, the details of what we have about the rape of Tamar and what happened with Ammon and Absalom, somebody that would be close to the family would have to know all the intimate details of that. And so they think it's Ahimaaz that did that. At any rate, what we find out is that the rebellion of Absalom is over, and David goes back to Jerusalem. And almost immediately after that, not too long after that, what happens, this is Abiathar came up, and Zadok also would live to bring the ark. This is a story about bringing the ark. Up in Ephraim, there was a man by the name of Sheba, S-H-E-B-A, Sheba, who asked the question, why are we all this much involved in the 10 tribes with what goes on in Jerusalem with David and his family troubles? This is a family squabble. We don't have to get involved in that. And Sheba starts his own rebellion. Say, let's get the 10 tribes of Israel separated from Judah. David himself says that this is a much more dangerous situation as far as his kingdom is concerned than the rebellion of Absalom, because it could very easily split up the United Kingdom. And so what David does is he calls Amasa. Who's Amasa? Amasa is now the head of the army. After it became known that Joab had killed Absalom, David says, that's enough of that guy. It takes the control of the army away from Joab and gives it to his cousin Amasa. And Amasa is called, said, go after this guy Sheba and stop this rebellion. Turns out that Sheba's a little bit slow on the uptake, and before he actually gets a chance to do it, Abner comes to Amasa and kills him. This is the third murder that we have, outright murder. Actually, this is kind of interesting. If you look at that picture rather carefully, you'll notice that Joab is grabbing him by the beard, but he also has a sword in his hand, and he kills Amasa. So Amasa is taken out of it, and Joab then takes over, and he pursues this man Sheba. And they pursue him all the way up to this place called Abel Beth Maacah. Remember Dan? Remember the tribe that moved from the south? This is way above the Sea of Galilee. They came to this city, and it tells how they put that city under siege because that's where Sheba was. And it says they built a rampart so they could crawl up so they could get into the city. Before they actually got into the city, while it was under siege, one of the women in the city, all we know about her is a woman from Abel Beth Maacah, came out and pleaded with Joab, don't devastate this city. And Joab says, no, we don't have any intention to. We just want Sheba. We want to get rid of him. And the woman tells Joab, don't worry about it. Tomorrow morning you'll have Sheba's head. And I think the last picture I have here, here's a picture of the woman of Sheba throwing down the head of Sheba. And this allows Joab and the army to go back to Jerusalem. Now, the 2 points I wanted to make here are these. One is that with David and David's experiences, in particular here in Jerusalem, we have an excellent example of what Moses was saying to the Israelites before they went into Canaan. If you are a righteous people, you will be blessed. If you are an unrighteous people, you will not be blessed. You will have bad time. Was David blessed for a long time? As soon as he became an adulterer and a murderer, what happened? Things were a disaster for him. And things were a disaster for him in the worst possible way. Not by losing battles or anything, but by having his whole family crumble under him. That was the one point I wanted to make. I don't know whether I got this across or not, but you notice that once Zadok shows up on the scene, Zadok and Abiathar don't seem to be at odds with it. You would expect that Abiathar in particular might take exception to the fact that after all these years that he spent with David, now all of a sudden he has to become a co-priest and not the priest. But we don't find any sense of any animosity whatsoever between Abiathar and Zadok. As a matter of fact, I think the last slide I had, shows the last verse that's in the chapter 20, which describes this rebellion by Sheba. And what it says that Zadok and Abiathar were the priests. And so right up until the very end, Zadok and Abiathar were the priests, the co-priests. And like I said, there was no real animosity between them. Now the question is, what happened that changed that? Next week, what I'm going to show you is that the Abiathar and Zadok do get on the opposite sides. They get on opposite sides, and it has to do with, guess what it has to do with? Has anybody watched television lately? Have you seen anything about politics? You ought to see what politics is like when you have a situation where a David is old and there has to be a succession. Have you ever heard anybody make some guesses as to who's going to be running for president and for? All right, you can well imagine people were looking at the situation with David and his sons as to who was going to be the next king. That was one point I wanted to make because that becomes very significant next week. The other point I wanted to make is that we see the Deuteronomic theology following through with David is probably the best example of the righteous being rewarded and the wicked are going to be punished. And David is punished in a most unusual way, and that is he's hurt through his family. Next week we'll take a look at it. And the other thing I found kind of interesting is I don't want to encourage you to do this, but you should read this chapter. But I'll tell you, the Deuteronomic historian that put this together, took the material that he had for Ahimaaz, also recognized something else. He wanted to make this book readable. And I'll tell you what, sex sells, and there's enough sex in there to satisfy almost anybody. The seduction of Tamar is a very interesting story in itself. And of course we can always wonder what went on between David and Bathsheba. But next week when we talk about Abiathar and Zadok, we find out this is just a matter of politics, pure and simple. But politics that ended up in having a tremendous effect on the Bible and the way the Bible was written and the way the Bible was put together. And I'll try it again next week. I was thinking of something else you folks ought to be thinking about. You're going to have to find some teacher that's a little bit more healthy than I am. Start looking.
Earl, it's going to find it difficult to find anybody to replace you.
Yeah.
No.
Sure. I don't think anybody in this room will attempt it. Look around and see if there's anybody with.
Anybody volunteering? If I have any regret of this teaching is that I get so much more out of it than I'm able to impart it. I've gotten to know some parts of the Bible and appreciate just what is going on. Next week, I'll be pointing out some things also that I think are rather significant of how influenced we are by the Bible and how much of our feelings center around just a few things. And we'll talk about have you ever heard of any conflict existing in religions? Well, one big conflict existed as far as the Israelites were concerned. There were people that were very pro-Moses, and there were a number of people that were very pro-Aaron, Moses' brother, the Aaronites, and we call them Mushites, the Moses followers, and how this came about and how it shows up in the Bible as well. So until then, I got this one more lesson to go, and then you can tell me who's going to take over. Because Carl, I want to thank you so much for what you're doing, trying to keep this class together like this.
Earl,
Not a problem. Not a
Well,
problem.
Earl,
yeah.
we should have taped your lessons for the last 10 years, and we could repeat it, we could play it back.
As I understand, there are tapes. I ask only one thing concerning those tapes. Don't make me look at them. I can remember I heard comments on one tape, the first one I made. You know what the comment was? He needs a haircut.
Are you sure?